There is nothing like a morning funeral for sharpening the appetite for lunch, and when, in July 1941, we returned from Shaw Cemetery, Newbury, everybody felt peckish. My mother had been able, despite wartime rationing and restrictions, to assemble a splendid spread, and we all sat down and fell to with a will. We had been burying, I am very sad to say, my father, and I mean no disrespect when I suggest how greatly preferable the aftermath of a funeral is to that of a wedding. The sense of relief is immense. The household, after a troubled night, has been early astir. A sketchy breakfast in funeral clothes has been followed by the arrival of elderly and distant relations not glimpsed since the last funeral. Yes, it's me again, Edith Bagshaw. There is anxiety about the efficiency of the undertaker. However, the moment the cemetery has been left behind, everybody cheers up and compliments fly. How nicely Canon Wetmore spoke. I oughtn't to say it, dear, but black suits you. And there is, of course, lunch to look forward to. Now, nobody's to rush off. My father was admirably businesslike, and on his death everything was found to be in apple pie order. However, his will contained a legal difficulty eagerly pounced on by the lawyers concerned. We had at home, inherited from my Essex grandmother, a grey parrot of great age called Bobby. Somewhere along the line, somebody had taught him to say, "Enjoying yourself?" in a markedly perky and sneery manner, together, alas, with "How are your bowels?" for which he employed a more solicitous tone. Visitors thus addressed found this disconcerting. Well, in his will, and more or less as a joke, my father bequeathed the parrot, with other things, to the maid who had tenderly looked after it, and to whom, as to all of us, it was devoted. The legal minds then got to work, and my mother was pestered with endless queries. What was the value of the parrot? By that time Bobby had, like many another, pulled out all his breast feathers. He had also developed a loud cackle, possibly caught from me, and not even the neediest zoo would have given him house room. My mother replied that the parrot's value was to us limitless, but negligible otherwise. No good, and back they came. What would the bird fetch at auction? The conception of Bobby on a stand at Sotheby's, inquiring after everyone's bowels, we found to be diverting. But eventually he was mentally knocked down by us at a fiver. Although my mother loved my father dearly and for life, she much disliked her wedding at Ilfracombe on April the 19th, 1906. There is little to be said in favour of elaborate weddings, gatherings which, after all, kick off with the main item on the agenda and dwindle into anticlimax. There's little to delight the eye or ear, the unfortunate hats, speeches, telegrams, jokes, the examination of the presents. I think I can just spot our kebab skewers behind that ghastly lamp, and the worryingly purple faces of some elderly guests. Dotted about are middle-aged couples who too once had high hopes and who now have thoughtful faces. Meanwhile the hired waiters are itching to be off. Will that be all, Gov? My father didn't like young children, but in due course found himself blessed with two of them, my brother Brian appearing in 1907 and myself in 1910. To say he didn't like them shouldn't be taken to mean that he positively disliked them. He quite liked the idea of them, but simply preferred to be where they weren't. Indeed, there was a family tradition, if such it may rather grandly be called, for a parent not seeing more than was strictly necessary of his children. My father and his three brothers were somewhat taken aback one day, when, on returning from some outing, they found pinned to the front door a notice in their father's hand, which said, "In future, boys will enter by the side door." This meant they avoided the hall and their father's smoking room, a sanctum where he liked to enjoy a cigar and read Dickens. But I was by nature a loving little boy, and was much saddened by this paternal aloofness and mild antipathy. I saw other children perched happily on their father's knees, and often dandled, a nowadays unfashionable verb. To jog a child cheerfully up and down was well beyond my father, and would have been abhorrent to all the adult male members of his family, a disappointing lot, not a dandler among them. It needs no trick cyclist's £50 fee to announce the result of this emotional imbalance, a determined search on my part for substitute father figures. Even though I was only about 4, my affections were violent ones, and no male over 20 was safe. An easy prey was my cousin Willie Thompson. He was a pushover where children were concerned. In the First World War he was in a Highland regiment, and I lived in dread that the rascally Germans would get him. But he survived and married, and remains to this day a charming pushover. To cover Willie's absences, I acquired 2 understudies. Every day a man came to clean boots and shoes and knives. On Sunday mornings I sat with him in an outhouse shed while he cleaned and polished and chatted, and I gazed raptly. Sometimes Sundays contained a double treat. My parents were members of the Roehampton Golf Club, and this produced the second understudy. On Sundays we often piled into the car and made for the members' tea-room. Here a bell-push on the wall summoned tea and a steward, who happily liked children, and for whose arrival I waited breathlessly. Sometimes I was allowed into his private hinterland of sinks and crockery and glasses, and could watch him washing up. My father took all this quite calmly, and seemed, more than anything, relieved. Every Christmas time we all betook ourselves to my widowed Essex grandmother. I was deeply attached to her, and at Christmas dinner I used to watch with some anxiety the changing colours on her face. Her blood pressure was said to be the highest in Essex, and was even rumoured to have broken during a test Dr. Bentley's apparatus, though this fact came from my Uncle Oswald, not always a trustworthy informant. There were, of course, crackers, which contained the usual paper hats, none of which ever suited my grandmother, and made her look either like Napoleon on a bad day, or a member of the French Revolution, en route for Versailles, with a grievance. From an early age I loved to laugh, and my Essex grandmother was a prime chuckler and a great ally, but she also had her glum and sober side. She had an enormously wide correspondence with various friends and relations, on whom life's misfortunes seemed to have crowded in to an unreasonable extent, and it was her custom to read out at the breakfast table the latest bulletins from the different horror fronts. This was danger time for me. There was one particular family, my poor old Gunstons, who were in a permanent pickle. No flu germ avoided them, no rail crash occurred without them being on the train and at the very centre of the disaster. If a Zeppelin dropped a bomb, it landed near the Gunstons. The Gunston children caught with hideous regularity anything that was going in the way of croup or diphtheria or measles. If Mr. Gunston invested in shares, it was a signal for the bottom to drop right out of the market. We thought the Gunstons had no more, so to speak, to offer, but no. The eldest Gunston son married, and himself begat a series of children, all of them from birth woefully trouble-prone. Fresh news of them came one disastrous morning. The first child had got rickets. The second child had swallowed a safety pin. And the third child, gloomily read out my grandmother as she turned over the page, has a pronounced strabismus. I choked on my kipper, burst into uncontrollable giggles, and was in deep trouble for days. Before long, I had another bad lapse. My grandmother, like many of her age and generation, took a keen interest in death. Funerals provided many an enjoyable sortie. Hardly a week seemed to pass, dear old Kate Turner has gone, without my grandmother being seen in deepest black and about to set off for a burial ceremony. On one occasion my mother and I were bidden to accompany her, for we knew the victim, dear old Maud Laver, and thus became suitable funeral attenders. Uncle Oswald, who laughed as much as I did, volunteered fatally to accompany us, succeeded in making me giggle uncontrollably, and we arrived at the church in such a state of disarray it was considered inadvisable for me to be present. I was sent home in the car in disgrace, and poor old Maud Laver, who was a dear and wouldn't have cared a hoot, had to shuffle her way into the hereafter without me. My other grandmother, my Devon grandmother, didn't much like me, as I looked so like my father, whom she positively disliked, for he was the interloper who had removed her only child, my mother. She died while I was at Cambridge, and it was no surprise to find she had left my brother a handsome sum of money and nothing for me. But I've decided to rise above it. I have sometimes wondered what considerations led my parents in 1916 to choose Stirling Court on the Hampshire coast as a prep school for first my brother and then for me. It can hardly have been the accommodation and the food. A passing illness, probably of nervous origin, prevented me from joining my brother on the special train at the beginning of the summer term of 1920, and I had therefore to be inserted into the school a week late, and was taken by my father. Over tea with the headmaster, the well-known clichés poured forth. "Soon find his feet. We'll keep an eye on him. Nothing to be afraid of." When my father left and I was alone, fear in various forms was instant, and homesickness was for a time a daily misery. Fortunately, I knew better than to be seen blubbing. But for me to have been removed from home at the age of 9 and placed in cheerless and outstandingly unsybaritic surroundings was a traumatic experience that will be with me to the grave and beyond. Macbeth, who remarks on his first entrance that he has never before seen so fair and foul a day, plainly wasn't educated at Stirling Court. I must freely confess that the cricketing tone of Stirling Court could not be counted among the best. Many of us had acquired a little speciality that was all our own. A boy called Mould bowled sneaks of a really sensational speed and accuracy, varying them with lofty deliveries that appeared to descend from the stratosphere. A boy called Westmore used to pretend to have hurt his ankle, and playing at mid-off limped quite a bit, encouraging opposing school teams to try to snatch a single. There were no fewer than 5 run-outs in a needle match against Fairfields. Murphy, I regret to say, but truth is truth, who fielded at point, had perfected a range of noises which considerably unsettled prim batsmen from more sedate schools. And my special friend Williamson, when called upon to bat, had developed, for use against umpires, a stare so compelling and disturbing that few ever dared to give him out, even though, bulky as he was plainly constantly impeding the straight passage of ball to stump. My own thing, and I cannot recommend it too highly, was to use the bat the wrong way round, presenting the triangular side to the ball. The results pass all expectations, the ball ricocheting quite unpredictably, now here, now there, and as often as not flying to the boundary to the amazement of all. During one match I found myself at the crease with Williamson, playing our great rivals, Dumbleton Park. Williamson had already survived 4 fully justified appeals for LBW, and one of the umpires had started to twitch nervously. Another of Williamson's devastating ploys was to request umpires, especially after a no ball, to "speak up, please." On that occasion Williamson's scowls at the umpires and my wrong-sided bat produced between them 18 runs. I expect in the long winter evenings at Stirling Court they speak of it still. But it was in scripture classes that Williamson rarely came into his own. He had a splendidly inquiring mind, especially when he suspected, how right he usually was, that the full truth was being withheld from him. At Stirling Court we did Genesis in the 6th form. It was probably considered too sensational and disturbing for younger boys. Williamson had already caused considerable consternation among the teaching staff by insisting on having the word whore explained to him. "An immoral woman who sells herself for gold, and I don't want to hear another word from you this lesson, Williamson." And he had followed it up with eunuch, "a handicapped male person, sometimes in the service of an Eastern prince, and come and see me after prayers, Williamson." In Genesis, as soon as we reached the cities of the plain, and Sodom in particular, Williamson's alert mind spotted, as usual, that we weren't being told all. The story, as watered down for our youthful ears, was feeble in the extreme. Everything hung, as no doubt you'll recall, on a secondary meaning of the verb to know. This, we were told by young and blushing Mr. Sinclair, just meant getting to know you, and merely indicated a chummy approach. "I'm Uz, and this is my friend Obal." But why then the fire and brimstone? And why, most revealing of all, the blushes? As soon as the lesson was over, Williamson flew to the school library, and searching through Chambers' invaluable dictionary, found what he was looking for: to have sexual commerce with. Next day a fresh persecution of poor Mr. Sinclair began, by now in deep trouble over Lot's unconventional behaviour in the mountains behind Zoar. "Please, sir, what does commerce mean?" "It depends in what sense, Williamson," and so on. At Stirling Court it was the custom to celebrate the end of the summer term by treating the parents and local residents to an entertainment provided jointly by the school staff and boys. The music mistress, Mrs. Wakefield, a resplendent figure in coffee lace, was always perched at the upright, getting us off to a fine start with a tuneful selection from The Gondoliers, with much fancy fingering and elaborate crossing of the arms. Then, to a jerky rattling of curtain rings, the curtains parted to reveal 4 alarmed treble singers, nearly blinded by the footlights, and who, by ancient usage, gave us what was always described as a traditional English air, quite often early one morning, Mrs. Wakefield, all smiles, helpfully thundering out the melody. With that safely, more or less, out of the way, our hearts sank. Again, by old custom, item number 2 featured the sportsmaster, genial Captain Murray, in a baritone solo. For the 4 years I was at the school, his song was the same one. It told of the open road and the fine, free life of the wayfaring pedestrian. It started spiritedly. "When you jogging along the high road, with your luck all upside down." Nobody could have jogged more cheerfully than Captain Murray. For this melodious piece he wore tattered corduroy trousers supported by a leather belt. With legs well apart and a thumb tucked into the waistband, he was, pictorially, the school's defiant answer to Peter Dawson. But there it ended. The captain's voice was thin and scratchy and quite tremendously off-key. The more musical boys winced, and even Mrs. Wakefield, the personification of loyalty, wore a strained look. One summer term, Matron electrified the entire school by coyly announcing that, if we would really and truly like her to, she would recite a poem which she referred to as The Daffodils. By Wordsworth, she added, a positive mine of cultured information. She had, she told us, done it as a girl, and had now refreshed her memory, and was only too delighted to pronounce herself as being word-perfect. Her offer was naturally gratefully accepted. One had never dreamt that such virtuosity would emerge from behind that crackling white starch, which normally only dispensed iodine, zinc ointment, bracing talk, I've had quite enough of your nonsense, and Gregory powder. With cries of, "No, no, I shall wait for the night," Matron refused to reveal her powers at any rehearsal. And so, with Captain Murray's last despairing wails, "There's no luck waiting along the high road for a vagabond like me," still echoing round the hall, Matron, impressive in mufti, made her stately appearance. I only wish I could report a dazzling triumph, but it was no such thing. She began quite well, and seemed all set for booming out the finale. But after, "For often on my couch I lie," disaster struck. Her voice tailed despairingly off, and she dried up completely. Of course, in those days we didn't call it drying up. Matron stopped speaking, we said. Pluckily, but how unwisely, she started all over again, evidently with some idea of getting a fresh run at the thing and bridging the gap. She wandered lonely as a cloud once more, only to come adrift again. The headmaster tactfully led loud applause. Matron had the nerve to take a bow, and the curtains rattled mercifully too. By dint of being generally odious and ceaselessly badgering poor Mr. Riches, our compere, I had secured for myself a solo appearance. My passion to display myself was quite unbridled, and so Mr. Riches kindly sent up to the publishers, Samuel French, for a suitable recitation. It was entitled The Single Hair, and described itself as a comic monologue. To this day I can, heaven help me, remember every word of it, a shining example to Matron. It began with a strong comedic couplet. "He was not bald, for on his shining cranium remained one hair, its colour pink geranium." After several more equally hilarious couplets, the hair falls off into his soup, is rescued, and a taxidermist is called in. And so to the payoff. "And stuffed within its case of glass installed, it shows the world he was not always bald." To utter this gem I was dressed in Pierrot costume, and the applause was tumultuous. Even today I sometimes in dreams deliver the piece again, and frighten myself awake, sweating with the horror of it all. In the holidays it was always very agreeable to stay with Williamson's family, and later, during Cambridge vacations, with other families. And it was a sadness to me that I dared very seldom invite anybody back in return. Few of my friends could, I felt, be exposed to the eccentricities that awaited them. School friends would generally be deposited by a parent in a car, or a Cambridge friend would arrive in his own car, and cars were the trouble. My father, for reasons that can only have been comprehensible to himself, used to attack motor cars. Attack them physically, I mean. Motor cars in those days had detachable lamps, large and bulbous motor horns, toolboxes clamped to the running board, flapping side curtains, and spare tires nestling in a sort of groove and held in place by leather straps. In cases of really deluxe machines, a speaking tube permitted dowagers, cocooned in fur rugs, to give instructions, Harrod's first, to their chauffeurs. Well, My father had discovered that some of these embellishments would, if given a vigorous enough push, become detached from their moorings and then fall with a pleasing clatter onto the gravel of our drive. Toolboxes sometimes split open and scattered spanners about. Heaven! But if they all held firm, he would then, to make up for the disappointment, kick the car's tires and wheels for 10 minutes or so. One never knew, a puncture might develop. Another anti-car pastime, when electric starters came in, was to run the battery down. Friends arriving for tea had to be warned of this risk and advised to leave their cars elsewhere and pretend they had arrived on foot. This gave my father an opportunity of explaining to them that they had missed several valuable shortcuts, but at least their cars were undamaged. In my last winter term at Stirling Court, something happened that was profoundly to influence my life. In the course of a school debate, I said something or other that made everybody laugh, and laugh loudly and long. I was surprised and delighted in equal quantities. What a splendid sound! Since that time, I have sought laughter wherever possible. Not a very lofty aim in life, perhaps, but I don't for one moment regret it.